Good afternoon, everyone. You may well be wondering why the RSPB is talking at this conference. So, to put us in a bit of context, yes, we are a predominantly UK-focused nature conservation NGO, but we do have a very large sustainable fisheries programme operating both in UK waters and then in the Baltic and around Iceland, and then in particular in the South Atlantic, and with teams on the ground working with fisheries in Namibia and South Africa, and then right around the southern cone from Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Ecuador and Peru. Our work has originally been focused very much on the issue of seabird bycatch in fisheries, but as part of what we hope is a responsible marine programme, we are very conscious of the need to be integrating the human rights and welfare perspective into our work. We are therefore a supporting entity for human rights at sea and have done some recent work with them, which I'll be talking about. And it's not just that we feel that this is part of our responsible fisheries programme, it's also with the blunt reality that we don't feel that any vessels which aren't respecting human rights will be respecting the environmental regulations, which is what our members are supporting us to work on and improve in the sector. I head up the UK Overseas Territories team at the RSPB. There are still 14 UK overseas territories dotted around the world, from the sort of more well-known, such as the Falkland Islands and Gibraltar, to the probably less well-known, such as Tristan da Cunha or Anguilla. Now, together, the UK and the overseas territories have the fifth largest marine zone in the world, and there is a high level of devolution in many of these territories. Small territory governments with populations of anything from 48 in the Pitcairn Islands to 270 in Tristan da Cunha down here in the South Atlantic have to put in place their own legal frameworks to manage their fisheries, often very dependent on the fishing sector for their GDP, but starting from a baseline of very limited capacity, and often not as much support as one would hope or expect from the UK government, for whom the overseas territories can be somewhat out of sight and out of mind, especially not having any political representation here in the UK. So the fishery situation is very different across different territories, and I'm just going to focus today on work in relation to standards on the foreign flagged fleets in 3 of the South Atlantic overseas territories. The first being Ascension Island in the sort of equatorial South Atlantic. Ascension is going through a big decision-making process at the moment and has been upping its standards, and currently there's only 2 Taiwanese flagged tuna longliners operating per year in Ascension's waters. I'll also talk about the Falkland Islands, and in particular the fleet of interest is the 100 squid jiggers that come in every year, mostly Taiwanese and Korean flagged. There are quite a number of other fleets operating in the Falkland Islands, but mostly under EU flags and of less interest for this presentation. And then finally, South Georgia, which is right here at the very bottom, very elongated EEZ, just above Antarctic territory. And the toothfish longliners that are operating there from a number of different fleets. So, very sensitive button. I'll put it down. So in Ascension Island, I've just brought up a map on the right which shows the sort of distribution of big eye tuna catches across the tropical Atlantic over the last 50 years, and you can see the EEZ of Ascension Island slap bang in the middle of it. It's been a major big eye tuna fishing area, a really difficult governance situation to try and get to grips with this fishery, as Ascension is a sort of military working island. There's no permanent population based on the island, and there's no local pelagic fishery. So the government there has been selling long lining licenses to foreign vessels, predominantly Taiwanese longliners operating on the high seas around Ascension, and they get their license to come in to fish and then to leave again, and they're not actually allowed onto island or into port due to the security concerns there. So as well as concerns around the environmental sustainability and the catches, big question marks around the conditions on these vessels. And from our perspective, as non-experts in the human rights at sea world, it seemed to us from sort of preliminary assessments that there was much less knowledge about some of the tropical Atlantic high seas fleets compared to some of the work going on in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, or famously around New Zealand on some of these issues. So working with our NGO coalition colleagues and funded with support from the John Ellerman Foundation, we commissioned a report from Human Rights at Sea International, just really trying to get to grips with these questions of what might be going on in this fishery operating in British waters, but really without necessarily much oversight happening. The conclusions are up here. Apologies that they are half cut off, but the key word was no evidence on the top line of abuses, but the risks extremely opaque and difficult to assess, and some clear gaps in the legislative framework on Ascension. Certainly the licensing makes no reference to human rights and doesn't request any crew-focused information. The crews would appear to be predominantly Filipino, Indonesian and Taiwanese crews, and a suggestion that whilst there may be less risk around employment infractions for the Filipino fishermen, some serious question marks around Indonesian and Taiwanese crews, and very helpfully some very constructive new text proposed for fishing licenses in Ascension's waters. The Ascension Island is actually currently having a big management decision process about the future of its entire waters and whether to continue with the fishery or not. But their formal response has been that they will consider incorporating all the recommendations of this report if they decide to continue with that licensed commercial fishery from next year. And Ascension is part of a wider UK government programme called the Blue Belt, which is famous for making some large-scale marine reserves around the territories and working to improve sustainability. And that Blue Belt programme is working with a lot of the fisheries in the different overseas territories. So we've really been trying to use this report to suggest that the Blue Belt programme should incorporate this agenda into its wider work. And again, unfortunately, we only submitted this report to them 6 weeks ago, so I've had no more than a holding response at present, but certainly some encouraging noises for other territories as well, that this is now something firmly on their agenda. Jumping further south to the Falkland Islands, which is very heavily dependent on its fishing sector. Got some excellent management in place on many of its fisheries. Safety vessel inspections had always been taking place, but by 2015 concerns had really become focused on the squid jiggers in particular, and this is a headline from the brilliantly named local weekly newspaper, the Penguin News, with the tragic story of what had been 9 jumpers in a week from those Taiwanese jiggers, one of whom had drowned in the 4 degrees Celsius waters. The Falkland Islands government, in their research and interactions with crew, always came across many different reasons for why crew were so regularly jumping overboard and trying to get off their vessels. But in particular, with the increased attention from this particularly tragic event, a fishing vessel crew conditions working group was established back in 2015 to address the issue. Sorry, I'm afraid I'm all framed to the wrong size on this, but the key news here is that the Falkland Islands government did grasp the nettle on this issue, decided to go beyond flag state demands and introduce new licence conditions incorporating provisions from the Work and Fishing Convention on fishing operations, crew management, food, water accommodation and fishers' work agreements. And there is a new code of practice for fishing crew now in place. They've also established a new port welfare committee and have some very proactive multilingual outreach to dissuade jumping. And indeed, there's been no more jumping into the harbour for the past 3 seasons. This is an example of one of the posters that they've put up. I mean, quite sad in a way how apparently easy it seemed to be to stop the almost, certainly the annual jumping and the almost annual deaths with some more proactive outreach and education works. And there is still challenges underway. There is an open inquest at the moment into 2 sea anchor deaths on that jigger fleet in June this year on 2 separate vessels. Finally, final overseas territory, which we've used as a bit of an example in our work across the overseas territories when we're trying to review their governance and make comparisons and almost engender some sort of friendly, healthy competition between the territories and their standards of fisheries management. Again, with separate support from the John Ellerman Foundation, looking at those standards in fisheries, we come to South Georgia. And South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands is an uninhabited territory, so managed more directly from the Foreign Office, and has therefore got to the stage where it's got very proactive measures in place. So all vessels pre-fishing season go into port in the Falkland Islands before actually even getting to South Georgia, and are checked by a specialist who's flown in from the UK that they meet all the standards of the Torremolinos protocol. So for us, that's one of our sort of key conversation starters in other territories, looking at what is already being done elsewhere amongst the territory peers. So thank you very much. I'm very happy to answer questions about any of the overseas territories and this little niche area.